Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Russia is in turmoil. War in Chechnya, a stagnant economy, a faltering democracy. But does trouble for Russia mean trouble for America? Helping us to answer that question are Leon Aron, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and author of a forthcoming biography of Boris Yeltsin; Peter Rodman, former national security aide under Presidents Reagan and Bush, and the author of a book about the Cold War, More Precious Than Peace. He is currently at the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. Peter Rutland, a professor of government at Wesleyan University and author of The Politics of Economic Stagnation in the Soviet Union, and Paula Dobriansky, former director of European and Soviet affairs for the National Security Council under President Reagan and now an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute. The topic before this house: is Russia a threat? Again, this week on Think Tank. For 40 years, from an American perspective, the Soviet Union was the most important foreign country. Then the Soviet Union split apart. The years following the collapse of communism have not been easy for Russia. When the Berlin Wall came down, people on both sides of the former Iron Curtain rejoiced. But today's mood is much more sober. Russia's gross domestic product has been shrinking by 19% in 1992 and by 12% in 1993. Inflation currently runs at 18% per month. And crime is increasing. The so-called Russian mafia controls an estimated 40% of all transactions in goods and services. Last December, Russian troops invaded the breakaway Republic of Chechnya, bombing its capital of Grozny to rubble. The death toll has reached a reported 24,000 civilians. Former republics like Ukraine and Kazakhstan fear that Moscow might turn expansionist and try to rebuild the Soviet empire through coercion or even outright invasion. It is said that President Boris Yeltsin, once called the George Washington of Russian democracy, is now overwhelmed by the job and suffers from ill health, perhaps alcoholism. Many Russian Democrats, like former Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, have turned against Yeltsin. Hardline nationalist parties are believed to be rising in popularity and influence. And while Soviet communism has been relegated to the dustbin of history, Russia still has thousands of nuclear weapons capable of hitting Western Europe and the United States. It used to be, gentlemen and lady, that the views on the Soviet Union were divided into hawks and doves, and now it seems to be that they are divided between optimists and pessimists. And I just wonder, just to sort of establish where you all are, maybe we'll just go quickly around the horn here, starting with Leon Aron, if you could just try to tell me where you are.
I think I'm a very cautious optimist. I think it's a very cold spring. We just had a big chill with Chechnya and perhaps frost, but it's still a sowing season.
Okay. Peter Rutland.
I'm also an optimist in the long term, although I wouldn't underestimate the problems in the short term. And in terms of a threat, Russia may be a threat to its own people more than to people beyond its own borders.
Paula Dobriansky.
In the short term, I'm a pessimist, specifically because of the events in Chechnya. The fact that Moscow has waged such barbaric actions in dealing with the circumstances do not bode well for the future. Lawlessness, corruption is still prevalent. The legacy of communism still has not been broken. In the long term, maybe a cautious optimist. In the short term, a pessimist.
Peter Rodman.
I'm a pessimist. Russia has always been a problem. I mean, that's the history of Europe teaches that Russia has always been a big, clumsy, difficult, powerful factor, and I think we're seeing that again. I wouldn't call Russia a threat. I think it's going to be a major problem. I see some disturbing trends in its foreign policy, and I think we need to be more realistic about it than we have been.
Why do people say, and it is said, that Russia has always been a problem? I mean, is it their geography? Is it their psychology? Is it their history? I mean, Leon, you grew up in Russia, right?
Yes, well, it certainly was a problem for me as I was growing up. Well, I think there are a number of things, Ben. It's a positioning sort of between Europe and Asia. It's the tradition of authoritarianism. It's sort of inability to decide whether they belong to Europe with enlightenment and free enterprise and democracy, or whether they belong to Asia. And it's also almost perennial insecurity, which largely was brought upon by its own expansion. That led Russia to this paradoxical situation that the more expanded, the more insecure it became.
I'm not sure we should say it's a problem. I'm not sure that any country can be described as a problem. Sure, Russia's had a difficult history, but at various points in history, it's pulled Europe's bacon out of the fire. It's saved Europe from sundry dictators, from Napoleon to Hitler, and saw it as a cycle of successes and defeats. And Russia right now is at the depths of a trough, but it will come back. And I don't think we should say that it's a demonic country that's doomed to cause problems.
Will it come back as a democracy?
Well, I think one of the greatest concerns today especially is the fact that democracy has not taken hold in the sense of the term in Russia, and especially that those countries in Central and Eastern Europe are very concerned about Russia's intentions. They're unclear. Take Ukraine, for example. Ukraine is very concerned about the events in Chechnya, especially because Russia has not really, in all intents and purposes, fully acknowledged the sovereignty and the existence of Ukraine. So the dust has not settled, and in that sense it does pose a problem, not only for us but for the Europeans.
But Paula, you say Russia isn't a democracy, but 5 years ago, would you have expected Russia to be this democratic?
No, I think that it has made certain strides, that is true. But still, it is not a democracy in the truest sense of the term. Clearly, the actions undertaken by Moscow in dealing with the situation in Chechnya defy any semblance of democratic, peaceful actions.
With one exception, Paula. It seems to me that indeed Chechnya was a test for Russian democracy. The executive failed completely.
And they failed it.
Executive failed. However, there's one silver lining there.
With the United States, I don't want to sound as if I'm pro the Russian government, but the United States was a democracy when we engaged in a civil war dealing sort of with a, quotes, breakaway republic. I mean, it's not just on its surface an outrageous behavior.
I don't think so. And you know, the Chechnya regime itself, the Daev regime, was far from democratic and blameless for all of this. But it failed in its brutality, it failed in its ineptness, it failed in the amount of casualties that it inflicted. More importantly, I think it failed in the way that war was presented to the people and the way that the executive worked with the parliament.
Peter Rodman?
The question you asked was why is Russia a problem? And I think Leon described the historical reasons very well, but I would emphasize one factor, which is its power. It is a huge concentration of power in the middle of the Eurasian landmass, and it has always been a problem for anybody who had the misfortune to live in its immediate neighborhood. And as Leon said, it's been clumsy. It's never been quite sure where it fit into the sort of international system. And I think
sort of like Germany.
Well, exactly like Germany, and it's not an accident that the history of the century has been Germany and Russia either competing or taking turns disrupting the peace. And we may, I worry that we may be heading in. Right now the balance of power in Europe is benign, but I think a lot of that is because the United States is sitting there as the stabilizer. I mean, this gets to the foreign policy concern for us, which is how do we, stabilize the situation, make sure that it doesn't become a threat. Because as I said before, it's not a threat; it's a problem.
Why did de Tocqueville, when he came here, I guess in the 1830s, say that the two great nations of the future were going to be the United States and Russia? What did he sense then? Was it
physical power that was dormant and yet was inevitable?
If you were writing about the world today, say for the next 100 years, would you say those are the two big powers still?
No, it's more. There are more other players: Germany, Japan,
China,
and China. Absolutely. So it's been evolving into a more multipolar system. But there's still. Russia is big, and particularly because it's in turmoil, and it is scary to anybody who lives in its immediate neighborhood.
Well, just continuing with that theme, it seems to me that when I talked about the silver lining in this Chechnya affair, one thing that it did show is that the Russian society is no longer synonymous with the Kremlin. that the people did not buy the party line, and most importantly, the media were completely free to report something that, in its explicitness and candor, I would say, was probably unequaled by any country at war except for that of the United States during Vietnam. I mean, what the coverage that you saw on national television during the Chechen War utterly belied the notion that this is an authoritarian regime in that particular regard, that it could crack down on the media whenever it wanted. So it seems to me that while the executive, I repeat, failed miserably in this war, we no longer could equate the Kremlin with Russia, something that is utterly new and, in my view, quite optimistic.
Leon, I would agree with your point. Absolutely, that is the silver lining. My reason before for mentioning why I don't see Russia at this time being a democracy in the fullest sense of the term is because, yes, there have been free and fair elections. Yes, as you mentioned, the silver lining, an important factor in the crisis in dealing with Chechnya has been the fact that there haven't been these constraints on media, that there has been a vibrant media, and in fact, public opinion has gone very much against the actions of Moscow. However, there still is not an independent functioning judiciary. There is no rule of law, which is a bedrock of any society. That has not taken hold. And secondly, although I think the population has certainly become more engaged in democratic ideas and values, the understanding and the grasp of it and its translation into concrete action, it still needs to evolve.
Let me
Much needs to be done.
What about the commercial realm? We said in the setup piece that 40% of the Soviet economy is run by the mafia, but that mafia, or earlier the black market, I mean, that can be viewed as sort of a rudimentary stage of real capitalism. You let all the illegal enterprises flourish and then you regulate them. I mean, is that plausible? And
I think that from the robber barons in American history to the current situation in China, we can see that this sort of informal economy, to use a more polite term than mafias, the two shade into one another. The informal economy is rife in every economy in the world, and in some economies it's more prevalent than others. In some economies, it's legislators that are getting shot down on the streets.
We did have our robber baron period,
well,
but we also had
people selling protection in the United States.
Well, but that's a local aberration. We also had a legal system and a political system, and as our society evolved, the legal system was able to dominate these. I mean, for the most part, these criminal elements. I mean, Russia doesn't have a legal system or an established political system. Everything is in turmoil at the same time, and there's no guarantee it's going to evolve smoothly into a nice bourgeois, law-abiding society.
It has a president. Leon, you are writing a biography about Mr. Yeltsin, and I guess the popular question is he a Democrat or a drunk? And I wonder...
Or both.
Or both.
It could be both. History is replete with Democrats that dabbled into all kinds of diversions.
Well, where do you come out on the general view of Yeltsin?
I think Yeltsin is a man who is generally in favor of democratic development, but who himself obviously does not have the experience being the party boss all his life, doesn't have the experience or very much understanding of the free market or democracy. And I think he was an ideal person for the barricades.
But it must have been a great temptation during Chechnya for such a man to close down the press, and yet he didn't.
That's precisely it. And not only that, but in his address to the nation, he reaffirmed that with all his problems that he has with the media, he still will not allow any sort of crackdown on the media. So I think Yeltsin, unfortunately, like Gorbachev, is a man whose hour has passed. I mean, he won the revolution. There's no doubt about that. But Russia now moved beyond the barricades, and in this space between the revolution and democracy, Yeltsin is lost. He could not find his proper niche, and I think part of it, part of the reason he decided on this utterly disastrous, both politically, morally, and militarily action in Chechnya, is because he was searching for a mission, he was searching for a way to establish himself.
The question I would like to come back to is whether Yeltsin, if he leaves the scene, can be replaced. Is he actually pivotal to the way that the political elite works in Russia? And that's the thing that worries me, that there may not be a clear transition to another
If we go to chaos and anarchy in Russia, is this cause for America to worry? I mean, is this a huge concern to us with the nukes rattling around? And
Well, you put your finger on it. The nukes are the main concern.
How many are there?
Well, there were 20,000, I think, before the arms reduction agreements that are bringing it down under 10,000.
Warheads.
Warheads, and that process is going on, and we have a stake in it. Now, so far, the Russians have had very good command and control over their nuclear weapons, but the continuing deterioration of their political authority, could change that. I mean, I think if Russia is weak, it obviously addresses the concern I raised at the beginning, that it's less of a threat to its neighbors. On the other hand, there's the nuclear anarchy, which is enormously dangerous. And secondly, I think there's an Aristotelian cycle. I don't think a great power endlessly tolerates humiliation. I think there will be a return to some central authority. I mean, a strong man, I think you'll have, I think anarchy will inevitably produce some kind of authoritarian regime. So we'll be back maybe where we started.
Yeah, Peter, when you say we might go back to where we started, we're not going to go back to the Soviet Union.
No. I think, but in terms of we're talking about its internal evolution, and we have the hopes for democracy, and I think if democracy turns into anarchy, it usually ends up in some authoritarian.
Right, but if it then goes retrograde, we are not as bad off as we were during the Cold War.
Well,
you don't have the whole
I think
USSR.
There's a big difference between Russian foreign policy and Soviet foreign policy. I think there's a big improvement. I mean, Russia is a state. I think it has a sense of its national interest, or it's groping for a sense of its national interest. It doesn't have this Leninist ideological thrust to disrupt the Western position all around the world. So even I, who worry about it, I can see a big difference.
Peter, wouldn't you agree, though, that although you said that Russian foreign policy is not synonymous with Soviet foreign policy, that nevertheless one of the problems or one of the challenges with which we face is that Russia's interests are not or have not been in common with ours. When you look at the situation of Bosnia, look at the situation in the Middle East of late, as well as in Europe, the handling of NATO, our interests or our directions have been rather divergent.
They're selling nuclear reactors and submarines to Iran, which I think actually bothers me more than Chechnya does, because this impinges directly on an area of vital interest to us.
And this is one of the, excuse me, I was just going to say, this is one of the, I think, the greatest challenges that we face, that's separate from what is evolving on the domestic scene, that internationally, instead of our interests being more parallel, that they have become divergent, and there's a polarization.
Well, I think Paul and Peter put their fingers on that. I think there are several aspects of new Russian foreign policy that need to be taken into consideration. I think, to me, the Russian foreign policy globally, not talking about the backyard, that's a separate issue, globally, is sort of like de Gaulle's France. That is, you lose in substance what you try to acquire in rhetoric, and you try to show, at least on the rhetorical, symbolic level, that you're not in U.S. pocket.
For example?
For example, Bosnia is one example. Iran is another example.
The debate is still pretty much within the Cold War scheme of things, where security is the dominant factor in foreign policy. I would suggest that economics is much more important in the present world. And in economic terms, there are lots of mutual interests between the West and Russia. And the things about selling nuclear reactors to Iran is purely economic. And if the Russians don't sell them in 5 years' time, the French or the Germans will be selling them.
No, but from our point of view, it's security because of the Middle East and the
But from the Russians' point of view, it's economics.
All right.
That may be.
Let me ask a question. How is the Clinton administration doing? Have they handled this situation well?
I don't think that they have handled it forcefully and directly. First of all, in the issue of Chechnya, the comparison that this is similar to America's Civil War, I don't think was an appropriate parallel. Secondly,
did the Clinton administration make that
Yes,
parallel?
The initial statement was that, well, this is an internal matter and we should wipe our hands of it. I don't think it can be viewed as an internal matter. It has ramifications for Russia's development. It has ramifications for us from a security standpoint, and it certainly has ramifications for Eastern Europe. Secondly, and very significantly, I think that the administration has put too many eggs in Yeltsin's basket and also has placed too much of an emphasis on a Russia-oriented policy.
Well, I think Paul is right in the sense that it should not be Russia only, but I think we will all agree it should be Russia first. And the reason for that is not any special predilection for Russia, but the fact that if Russia goes down, so will other countries.
And you have those nuclear weapons rattling around that nobody...
If I may just jump in on that, I don't think I would say it should be Russia first, because psychologically I think that sends a very wrong signal. Secondly, many of these countries, just as much as they are dependent upon the fate of Russia, I think if you do not have democracy in Ukraine, I think that is very much intertwined with the future of Russia. If
Peter
Ukraine
Rutland,
does not succeed.
Where do you come out on how Clinton's done, or the Clinton administration?
Well, I don't think there's been an effective policy, either a Russia first or a Ukraine first policy. I think there's been just a stasis in policy, which in the long run will probably be...
A what policy?
A stasis. There has been no real movement forward in American policy, and in the long run this is probably a good thing, because if America had adopted a determined policy earlier on, it would probably have been the wrong policy. So better to just be an observer on these processes.
Peter Rodman, you've generally been a critic of the Clinton foreign policy.
Yeah, I have been on this one in particular. I see it in geopolitical terms. I think Russia, you need to hedge against a possible reemergence of Russia. And yet I see, which means that if your first line of defense is Russian democracy, your second line of defense is the independence and security of all the new states that have emerged from the wreckage of the Soviet Empire. And so I think we have a geopolitical stake in Ukraine and in protecting the Eastern Europeans. And that's why I think the disproportionate foreign assistance that has gone to Russia is a geopolitical mistake. I mean, we have a stake in the independence of all the others just in order to stabilize the present situation and as a hedge against the possible, as I said, the emergence of Russia as a problem.
We are running out of time. Let me just ask you one personal question. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the people who dealt with the Cold War and the Soviet Union were sort of at the top of the food chain in Washington. That was what was really important. Now the Cold War is over. Do you find any difference? I mean, do people not return your phone calls? Are you no longer invited to as many parties?
No. But foreign policy as a whole is less important. And I worry about an isolationist mood in the country, because I think if the United States removes its stabilizing role or its stabilizing policy in the world, then I think all these problems would end up bigger than they otherwise could be.
Well, Ben, Henry Kissinger said famously that power is the ultimate attraction, right?
The ultimate aphrodisiac,
right? Exactly.
Said, right?
I didn't know if I could
that's
allowed to say
we
something
have a
like
very
that.
mature audience, right?
But I think Peter is right, though. While the foreign policy in general is changed, clearly I find that in retrospect that fear is also an ultimate attraction, and there's no doubt that the attention that's given to Russia and to those who are dealing with Russia is not what it used to be, but you're still inviting us, so we must be doing something
well, but
right.
we do more shows about welfare and affirmative action and crime than we probably would have done had this program started 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
All right, let me, just as a closing exercise here, again, we have to do it sort of briefly. Picture the year 2002, which is when 7 years now, when the budget is supposed to be balanced here. What will the Soviet Union look like?
Russia.
Right. I'm sorry. Well, okay.
I mean, that's an easy question.
Yeah. Right. What will Russia look like?
I think it will still be a country struggling economically and politically, but less of a threat to its neighbors than at any time in its 400-year history.
I think Russia will be seen as a major economic partner. It already supplies 50% of West Germany's gas needs. It's running a trade surplus. We should stop thinking of it as just having 20,000 nuclear weapons, but start thinking of it as a major trading partner.
I think that authoritarianism will reign in Russia in terms of the leadership. I think there will still be strong and vibrant dissident groups trying to change that, but unfortunately, politically, I see authoritarianism as reigning.
Well, if Russia gets back on its feet economically by then, I think it'll be more of a problem than it is otherwise.
Meaning that it would be a greater
It'll be
threat.
stronger, and I think we'll have a bigger problem in foreign policy.
Well, you managed to come out pessimistic
Yes,
either
yes,
way.
yes.
All right. Thank you, Leon Aron, Peter Rodman, Peter Rutland, and Paula Dobriansky. And thank you. We enjoy hearing from our viewers very much. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.